Welcome to the International Policing Podcast on capacity building and development. Putting together a capacity building and development plan is one thing, but effectively implementing it in the field, that's a whole other challenge. It's kind of like having a great recipe but not knowing your way around the kitchen.
That's a great analogy, and you're absolutely right. Implementation is where the rubber meets the road. Today we're going to unpack some key ingredients for success, focusing on local policing context, communication skills, change management, and problem solving.
Okay, let's start with the local policing context. I imagine this is especially critical in international policing where you're dealing with a wide range of cultural and institutional differences.
Absolutely. One of the biggest mistakes we can make is assuming a one-size-fits-all approach will work. Each host nation police force has its own unique culture, its own set of needs, and its own way of doing things. Trying to impose a prepackaged solution without considering these nuances is a recipe for disaster.
So what are some of the key factors we need to be aware of when assessing the local policing context?
Well, organizational culture is a big one. How hierarchical is the police force? How do officers view their roles and responsibilities? What are the prevailing attitudes towards things like accountability and transparency? These are all things that can significantly impact how receptive officers are to new initiatives.
That makes sense. You also mentioned community attitudes and gender dynamics. How do those factors come into play?
They're absolutely crucial. For example, if there's a history of distrust or tension between the police and certain communities, it's going to be much harder to implement programs that rely on community engagement.
So building trust with the community is essential, but that trust needs to be earned, not assumed.
And gender dynamics can be really complex. In some cultures, women may not be seen as having legitimate authority within the police force, which can create obstacles for female officers involved in CBD initiatives.
I imagine that can also affect how women in the community perceive the police and their willingness to engage.
You're absolutely right. It's a multi-layered issue, and it highlights the importance of conducting a thorough assessment of the local context before developing any kind of plan.
So you're saying we need to do our homework before we even step foot in the kitchen, so to speak.
Precisely. And even then, we need to be prepared to revise our plans as we go based on what we learn on the ground.
Okay, so we've got the recipe, we've assessed the kitchen, now we need to start cooking. And that brings us to our next ingredient, communication skills. I imagine clear communication is especially crucial in international policing contexts.
You can't overstate its importance. Think of it this way. If you're trying to build a house with someone who speaks a different language, and neither of you is quite fluent in the other's language, it's going to be pretty difficult to get that house built, right?
That's a great analogy. So we need to be mindful of language barriers, but it's probably more than just that.
It is. It's about cultural awareness, sensitivity, diplomacy. It's about understanding how your words and actions might be perceived by someone from a different cultural background. Even seemingly small things like body language or tone of voice can make a big difference.
It sounds like there's a lot of potential for miscommunication and misunderstanding.
There is, and that's why it's so important to be deliberate and thoughtful in our communications. We need to be clear, concise, and respectful. We need to listen actively and ask clarifying questions. And we need to be willing to adapt our communication style to fit the situation.
So it's not just about speaking clearly, it's about understanding how to communicate effectively in a cross-cultural environment.
There are some basic communication principles that can be really helpful, such as clarity, correctness, completeness, conciseness, concreteness, coherence, and courtesy. But it's more than just memorizing a list. It's about applying these principles in a way that is sensitive to the cultural context.
Okay, that makes sense. Can you give me a specific example of how one of these principles might play out in the field?
Sure. Let's take concreteness. Imagine you're trying to explain a new evidence handling procedure to officers in a country where resources are limited. Instead of just describing the ideal process, you might need to adapt your explanation to take those limitations into account.
So you might say, okay, in an ideal world, you would do this, this, and this. But given the resources you have available, here's a practical approach that will still ensure the integrity of the evidence.
You're acknowledging the reality of their situation while still conveying the key principles.
That's a great example. It highlights the importance of tailoring your message to your audience.
It does, and it's something we could spend hours discussing. We've only scratched the surface here, but hopefully this gives you a taste of how crucial communication is to successful capacity building and development.
Absolutely. It sounds like effective communication is the foundation upon which everything else is built.
I couldn't agree more. And that brings us to our next key ingredient, change management.
Okay, let's unpack this one. I know change can be difficult for anyone, but I imagine it's especially challenging within police forces, which tend to have deeply ingrained cultures and ways of doing things.
You're absolutely right. It's important to understand that change management is a process, not an event. You can't just flip a switch and expect everyone to embrace new ideas and ways of working overnight. It takes time, patience, and a strategic approach.
So where do we even begin?
Well, first, it's crucial to distinguish between change management and capacity building. Change management is about guiding the process of individual and organizational change, while capacity building is about equipping individuals and organizations with the necessary skills and resources to carry out their duties effectively.
So they're distinct but interconnected concepts. How do they work together in practice?
Think of it this way. Capacity building provides the tools, while change management provides the roadmap for implementing those tools effectively and ensuring they become ingrained within the organization.
That makes sense. It's like giving someone a new toolbox, but also showing them how to use those tools to build something meaningful and lasting.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that CBD is a long-term process, not a quick fix. Our ultimate goal is to see the changes adopted and sustained over time.
I imagine there are a lot of potential roadblocks along the way.
There are. And one of the biggest is resistance to change.
That's understandable. Change can be scary, especially when it disrupts familiar routines and power dynamics.
It can be, and that's why it's so important to involve stakeholders in the process from the very beginning. When people feel like they're part of the change rather than having it imposed upon them, they're much more likely to embrace it.
So communication and collaboration are key to successful change management.
Absolutely. And clear, consistent leadership is also essential. If those at the top aren't fully committed to the changes, it's going to be very difficult to get buy-in from the rank and file.
That makes sense. People need to see that their leaders believe in the changes and are willing to walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
And of course, we need to provide adequate resources to support the change process. This includes things like funding, equipment, training, and ongoing support.
That's like trying to build a house without enough bricks or tools. It's simply not going to work.
A very apt analogy.
So we've talked about the importance of local context, communication, and change management. That brings us to our final ingredient for today, problem solving.
Ah, yes. The art of navigating the inevitable bumps in the road.
I have a feeling we could dedicate an entire episode to this topic alone.
We probably could. But for now, let's just acknowledge that problems are an inherent part of any capacity building and development initiative. They're not a sign of failure, but rather an opportunity for learning and growth.
So how do we approach problem solving in a way that is both effective and constructive?
Well, one key is to have a structured approach. There are various problem-solving models out there that can provide a framework for systematically identifying, analyzing, and addressing problems.
Can you give me an example of one of these models?
Sure. One commonly used model is the SARA model.
What does SARA stand for?
SARA stands for Scanning, Analysis, Response, and Assessment. It's a cyclical process that guides us through identifying the problem, understanding its root causes, developing and implementing solutions, and then evaluating their effectiveness.
So it's not just about reacting to problems as they arise, but about taking a proactive approach to identify and address underlying issues.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that problem solving is an iterative process. We may need to revisit earlier stages of the process, reevaluate our understanding of the problem, or adapt our solutions based on new information or unexpected challenges.
That highlights the importance of flexibility and adaptability in this work.
And it also underscores the importance of continuous learning and improvement.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. Let's take a moment to recap the key ingredients for successful capacity building and development in international policing contexts.
Certainly. We started by emphasizing the crucial importance of understanding the local policing context. We need to recognize that a one-size-fits-all approach won't work, and that each host nation police force has its own unique culture, needs, and practices.
We then moved on to the essential role of communication skills, highlighting the need for cultural sensitivity, clarity, active listening, and a willingness to adapt our communication style to fit the situation.
Next, we explored the interconnected concepts of change management and capacity building, stressing the importance of guiding and supporting individuals and organizations through the process of change.
And finally, we tackled the realm of problem solving, emphasizing the value of a structured approach, flexibility, adaptability, and a commitment to continuous learning and improvement.
I believe this has been a valuable overview of the key elements involved in implementing CBD activities effectively. It's clear that this is a complex and multifaceted undertaking that requires careful planning, adaptability, and a deep understanding of the context in which we're operating.
I agree. And I think it's a great foundation for our listeners to build upon as they navigate the challenges and rewards of international policing work.
Indeed. Now let's shift our focus to the often overlooked aspect of problem solving in the world of capacity building and development.
It's funny. When we talk about CBD, we often focus on the positive aspects, the building up of skills and resources. But it's important to acknowledge that challenges are going to pop up along the way.
Absolutely. It's not a matter of if, but when. And those moments, those unexpected hurdles, that's where your real problem-solving skills are put to the test.
So it's not about avoiding problems altogether, but about having a solid game plan for when they inevitably arise.
And that's why having a structured approach to problem-solving can be so valuable. Think of it as a mental toolkit equipped with various methods and techniques to help you navigate those tricky situations.
Okay, I like that, mental toolkit. What kind of tools are we talking about here? Can you give me an example of a problem-solving framework that's commonly used in CBD initiatives?
Certainly. One that comes to mind is the SARA model. It's an acronym that stands for Scanning, Analysis, Response, and Assessment. It's a cyclical process that helps you break down a problem into manageable steps.
So walk me through it. How does SARA work in practice? Let's say, for example, we're working with a host nation police force to implement a new community policing program, but we're facing resistance from some officers who are reluctant to change their traditional ways of doing things.
Okay, great example. So using SARA, we'd start with the scanning phase, which involves identifying the problem. In this case, it's the resistance to the new community policing program. We want to clearly define what that resistance looks like. Is it passive? Is it active? What are the specific objections being raised?
So we're not just saying, oh, there's resistance. We're really digging into the specifics of what that resistance entails.
Exactly. Then we move on to the analysis phase, where we try to get to the root causes of the problem. Why are these officers resistant? Is it fear of the unknown? Lack of trust in the new approach? A perception that it's not going to be effective?
So it's about understanding the why behind the resistance, not just the what.
Precisely. Once we have a better understanding of the root causes, we can start brainstorming solutions in the response phase. This could involve things like providing more training on the benefits of community policing, addressing officers' concerns directly, or finding ways to incentivize participation.
So we're developing targeted interventions based on the specific issues we've identified.
Exactly. And the final stage is assessment, where we evaluate the effectiveness of our chosen solutions. Are they working? Are we seeing a decrease in resistance? Are officers starting to embrace the new program?
And if not, we go back to the drawing board. Right.
Exactly. That's the beauty of the SARA model. It's cyclical. It allows for ongoing evaluation and adjustment based on real-world feedback.
It sounds like a pretty solid framework.
Yeah.
But are there other problem-solving approaches that might be useful in CBD contexts?
Absolutely. Another helpful method involves a 6-step process that guides you from defining the problem to implementing and monitoring solutions.
What are the steps involved in this process?
Well, the first step is clearly defining the problem. It sounds simple, but you'd be surprised how often people jump into solution mode without really taking the time to fully understand the problem they're trying to solve.
Okay, so we need to be crystal clear about what we're dealing with before we start brainstorming solutions. What's next?
Next, we analyze the problem. We break it down into its component parts. We look at the contributing factors, the potential consequences, and the stakeholders involved.
So we're really dissecting the problem to understand it from all angles.
Exactly. Once we've done that, we can move on to identifying possible solutions. This is where brainstorming comes in. We want to generate as many potential solutions as possible without judging or censoring ideas.
So it's about quantity over quality at this stage.
Precisely. We can always narrow things down later. Once we have a good pool of options, we move on to choosing the best solution. This involves weighing the pros and cons of each option and considering factors like feasibility, cost-effectiveness, and potential impact.
So it's about making a strategic decision based on a careful analysis of the options.
Exactly. Once we've chosen a solution, we need to develop a plan of action. This involves outlining the steps we'll take, identifying the resources we'll need, and setting timelines for implementation.
So we're creating a roadmap for putting our chosen solution into action.
Precisely. And the final step is implementing the solution while monitoring its effectiveness. This involves putting our plan into action, tracking our progress, and making adjustments as needed.
So it's not just about setting a plan and forgetting about it. It's
No.
about actively managing the implementation process and being willing to course correct if things aren't going as planned.
And that flexibility, that willingness to adapt, is crucial to successful problem solving in any context, but especially in the complex world of capacity building and development.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. It seems like adaptability is a key ingredient for success, not just in problem solving, but in all aspects of CBD work.
You're absolutely right. The ability to adapt to changing circumstances, to learn from our mistakes, and to adjust our approach as needed is essential.
Okay, so we've discussed the SARA model and a six-step problem-solving process. These frameworks provide a structured approach, but are there any other tips or strategies you can share for effective problem-solving in CBD initiatives?
Well, one thing I've learned over the years is that it's important to engage all stakeholders in the problem-solving process. This includes not just the police officers we're working with, but also community members, government officials, and other relevant actors.
Why is that so important?
Because everyone brings a different perspective to the table. By involving a diverse range of stakeholders, we can get a more holistic understanding of the problem, generate more creative solutions, and build buy-in for those solutions.
So it's about leveraging the collective wisdom of the group.
Exactly. And it's also about fostering a sense of ownership over the solutions. When people feel like they've been part of the problem-solving process, they're more likely to be invested in the outcomes.
That makes sense. It's not just about imposing solutions from the outside, it's about working collaboratively to find solutions that work for everyone.
And another tip I would offer is to document your problem-solving process. This doesn't have to be anything fancy, but it's helpful to keep a record of the problems you've encountered, the steps you've taken to address them, and the outcomes you've achieved.
What's the value in doing that?
Well, for one thing, it allows you to track your progress over time. You can see what's working and what's not. It also helps you identify patterns or recurring challenges.
So it's like a learning journal for your problem-solving skills.
And it can be a valuable resource for sharing lessons learned with others.
Okay, so to recap, effective problem-solving in CBD involves having a structured approach, engaging stakeholders, and documenting your process.
That's a great summary. But I think it's important to add one more ingredient: a healthy dose of patience and perseverance.
Those are always good qualities to have.
Problem solving can be messy, and it rarely happens overnight. There will be setbacks, there will be frustrations, but it's important to stay the course, to keep learning, and to keep striving for solutions that are sustainable and effective.
So it's not just about fixing problems, it's about building the capacity to solve problems effectively over the long term.
And that's what capacity building and development is all about.
This has been a fascinating exploration of the complexities of problem solving in CBD initiatives.
Indeed, and I hope it helps our listeners feel better equipped to navigate the challenges they'll inevitably encounter in their own work.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the SARA model to the importance of stakeholder engagement and documentation.
But there's always more to learn, and we'll continue this discussion in our next episode.
Until then, stay safe and stay engaged in your pursuit of building stronger, more effective police forces around the world.
Welcome back to the International Policing Podcast on Capacity Building and Development. In parts 1 and 2, we explore the importance of local context, communication, change management, and problem solving. For this final part, we're going to zoom in on a skill that's absolutely foundational to all of these areas: communication.
You know, it's interesting. When I think about international policing, my mind immediately jumps to things like cross-border investigations or counterterrorism efforts. But effective communication, that's the thread that runs through all of it, isn't it?
It absolutely is. You can have the best plan in the world, the most skilled officers, the latest technology, but if you can't communicate effectively, it's all for naught.
And in the context of capacity building and development, I imagine communication takes on even greater significance. Because you're not just dealing with different languages, you're dealing with different cultural norms, different expectations, different ways of interacting.
Right. You hit the nail on the head. It's not simply about translating words. It's about bridging cultural divides. It's about understanding how your message might be received by someone from a completely different background, someone who may have a different understanding of authority, hierarchy, or even what constitutes polite behavior.
Okay, so how do we become more effective communicators in these complex cross-cultural environments? Are there any specific strategies or tips you can share?
There are definitely things we can do to improve our cross-cultural communication skills. One of the most important is to cultivate cultural awareness. This means taking the time to learn about the customs, values, and beliefs of the people we're working with.
So it's about doing our homework not just on the technical aspects of policing, but on the cultural landscape as well.
And it's an ongoing process, not a one-time thing. Cultures are dynamic, they're constantly evolving, so we need to be continually learning and adapting.
Okay, so we're learning about the culture, but how does that actually translate into better communication?
Well, for one thing, it helps us avoid making assumptions or generalizations. It allows us to approach each interaction with an open mind and a willingness to see things from the other person's perspective.
That makes sense. It's about moving away from a one-size-fits-all approach to communication and recognizing that what works in one context may not work in another.
Precisely. And it's also about being mindful of our own biases and how they might be influencing our communication. We all have biases, it's part of being human, but we need to be aware of them so we can mitigate their impact.
So it's about self-awareness as much as it is about cultural awareness.
Absolutely. And another key strategy is to be a good listener. This means not just hearing the words that are being spoken, but truly listening to understand the meaning behind them.
Active listening. What does it actually look like in practice?
It involves paying attention to both verbal and nonverbal cues. It's about asking clarifying questions to make sure you're understanding what the other person is saying. And it's about reflecting back what you've heard to confirm your understanding.
So it's a much more engaged and interactive process than just passively receiving information.
It is. And it's a skill that takes practice, but it's well worth the effort. Good listening builds trust, it fosters understanding, and it creates a foundation for more effective communication.
Okay, so we've talked about cultural awareness and active listening. Are there any other practical tips you can offer for communicating effectively in cross-cultural settings?
Well, one thing that often gets overlooked is the importance of nonverbal communication. This includes things like eye contact, facial expressions, body language, and even personal space.
I've heard that nonverbal communication can sometimes speak louder than words.
It absolutely can. And the challenge in cross-cultural settings is that these nonverbal cues can be interpreted very differently. What might be considered polite or respectful in one culture could be seen as rude or aggressive in another.
So we need to be aware of our own nonverbal communication and how it might be perceived by others. But how do we learn about the nonverbal cues of other cultures?
Observation is key. Pay attention to how people interact with each other. Notice things like how close they stand, how much eye contact they make, and what kind of gestures they use.
So it's about being attuned to the subtleties of communication.
And it's also helpful to do some research beforehand. There are many resources available, both online and in libraries, that can provide insights into the nonverbal communication norms of different cultures.
That's great advice. And I think it highlights the fact that effective cross-cultural communication is a skill that we can develop and improve upon over time. It's not something we're born with. It's something we learn and practice.
You're absolutely right. And the more we learn and practice, the more effective we'll become at building relationships, fostering trust, and achieving our goals in international policing context.
Well, this has been a fascinating exploration of the importance of communication in capacity building and development initiatives. It's clear that communication is not just a tool, it's the very foundation upon which successful collaborations are built.
I couldn't agree more. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our conversation on capacity building and development for international policing. We've covered a lot of ground, from the importance of understanding the local context to the nuances of cross-cultural communication and the art of problem solving.
I think our listeners have gained valuable insights that they can apply in their own work, and I know I've learned a lot from our conversation today.
Thank you for joining us for the International Policing Podcast on capacity building and development. We hope you'll join us again next time as we continue to explore the fascinating world of international policing.